Well, we've arrived at the point now where we're about to assemble the wheels into the frames. However, it's prudent here to pause assembly and paint the wheels and paint the frames, because once they're all assembled together, it's going to be very difficult to paint behind the wheels without gumming up the works. So I've mounted all the wheels on this Trespa board, slightly proud of the board, in little holes like this, and this is going to act as a great handle for me to move them around and paint in between the spokes. I'm going to have to paint the backs as well eventually, of course, but if I paint between the spokes from the front, life becomes simpler. So this is the paint I'm going to be using, Phoenix Precision Enamel Dirty Black. It's actually a dark grey colour, and I'm going to let it down with just plain ordinary white spirit, which I've decanted into a little jam jar there. This glass dish is going to be my palette, not a Pringle lid for a change. So let's open the paint and get going. Now you'll notice that I'm keeping my tinlet of paint in one of these little holders. It's very useful. This stops you from knocking the tin of paint over. I got mine from, I think it was the Phoenix Precision stand at one of the big model railway shows a few years ago. And I'm going to reach for a trusty cocktail stick to stir this paint up. Need to do this for a couple of minutes until you can't feel any lumps in the bottom, but not so critical as we're going to be brush painting rather than spray painting. So a couple of minutes have gone by, and using the cocktail stick as a dispenser, I'm going to drop a few droplets of paint. This comes with lots of pigment on it from the bottom of the tin onto the side of my glass dish. Now I should say at this point there is no right or wrong way of painting. This is just a technique that I've evolved for myself over the years, and it works for me. The thing to do is to experiment. So what I'm going to do is get some white spirit using this old eardropper and drop a few drops, not onto the paint in my dish, but near to the paint so it runs round. And this white spirit going down here is probably going to be invisible on the video, just a couple of drops. And the idea is that using the brush, if we zoom in closer there, I can pick up some white spirit, pick up some paint, and mix little bits of them to the consistency I want, and just test them out elsewhere on the glass, so that I've got quite a thin consistency. And I want it like this so that I can almost flood the paint onto the metal, and that way I'm not going to get visible brush strokes. Now I'm not an artist, but I've heard this sort of technique being referred to with oil paints as glazing. And what we'll need to do is build up the pigmentation using more than one coat. So if we get in a nice closer view now, you'll see that this is not covering the brass with a solid covering. You can still see the brass through it, but what I want to achieve is at least a thin layer of paint everywhere so that we don't see brass shining through the spokes of the wheels. It will get weathered lately if we want to weather it, but because it's so thin, this paint will dry fairly quickly, and in a couple of hours I can put another coat on top if I so desire. But keep going back to my palette, I can adjust as I'm going along the consistency of this paint. Keep it nice to work with. I don't really need to paint up the side of this, it's going to be hidden in the firebox, but just for completeness. You can see towards the left hand side of the picture there, that paint's already starting to dry off. And we won't have to wait too long once the first side's dried off before we can turn it over and paint the other side. And I'm just going to go along the very edges of the brass here with a much thicker consistency of paint, because the really thin stuff tends to run away and leave shiny corners. And I think we will need a second coat on this side. But while the first coat's drying, I can turn my attention now to the wheels. We'll start with the driving wheel, and I apologise, it's going to be a little bit out of focus here because I'm lifting up the board so that I can see into all these angles. And here, with this paint really quite runny, I can just flood it in between the spokes and down onto the inside edge of the wheel rims and make sure all areas are covered. I suppose this first thin wash is like something of a primer coat really, and will build up the depth of colour later on with a second coat, and of course later on, much later on, we can do some weathering. Now as I'm sloshing this paint around, I'm actually trying to be very careful to avoid getting any on the crank pin itself and onto the top face of the flange that's attached to the crank pin. I want to paint all around the base of that flange, but I don't want to end up having to get paint off the top of it, because that's going to be a bearing surface against the back of the coupling rods. So once the spokes and the centre boss are painted, I'm now going to work my way around the edge of the tyre. I'm going to be as careful as I can be not to get paint on the tread of the tyre, but if I do, it's not going to be the end of the world. I'll show you a way of removing that. But as I'm going round, I'm able to see the light reflected in each of the spokes, and I'm just twirling this round and round looking for bits that I missed, like that one. And there'll be plenty of bits that I missed. But I want to get it as well covered as I can. Obviously this will be handled, bits will get chipped off, but hopefully they'll be in places where it's accessible to touch them in once the loco assembly is complete. So now I've got my eye in, I can paint the second wheel much quicker. The brush I'm using, by the way, is a Humbrol Coloro. That's their mid-range with green handles. It's got synthetic bristles. It's quite robust and I find it really good for this kind of job. This one is a number 00. I got mine as one of a pack of 4 from my local model shop, but they're fairly cheap and fairly widely available. So after half a chassis block and 2 wheels, this paint's starting to go off a little bit in my glass dish, so I can add another drop of thinners and use that on the brush to try and revive this paint that's drying up the side of the dish. This is what I love about enamel paint, is you can just keep reinvigorating it and reinvigorating it. And then once I've got that paint to the consistency I want it, I can move on to wheel number 3. I think you get the general idea of me painting these spokes now, so let's skip ahead in time. And I've given all of these wheels 2 coats of paint and let them dry hard overnight. And now we're going to look at the backs of the wheels. And for this, I'm holding the wheel by the crank pin and using that as a handle. And same paint, same technique. This time, because it's the back of the spokes, I'm only going to give it 1 coat. All I want to do is just take down the shine so that when you get a view from the loco sideways under the chassis, you're not going to be seeing glinting brass turning round. And some of the paint I put on has come through and gone onto the back of the spokes anyway. But it's really only the sort of edges of the spokes that need covering. They're the only bits that will be seen. The back of the wheel that's around that centre boss will not be seen because it's hidden by the frames. So I can go close to the centre boss, but I must not put paint on it, because again that's a bearing surface. It's going to rub against the faces of the phosphor bronze bearing. Now here's an example of where I was a bit too enthusiastic painting the front face of the wheel, and hopefully you can see that I've got grey paint on the wheel treads. And this has dried for a couple of days, and all I'm going to do is take the edge of a cocktail stick and rub it, pressing on fairly hard in a sort of sideways motion, lying the stick against the wheel tread. This will rub off the paint from the wheel tread without damaging the paint that's on the front face of the wheel. Because I did paint, if you noticed, the front of the tyres of the wheels. I didn't paint the rear of the tyres of the wheels because they're going to rub against check rails and things, and I didn't want them leaving deposits of paint on the track in those kinds of places. And I can get the point of the cocktail stick right into the radius at the root of the flange as well. So this is a case of taking each wheel, looking at it under magnification and methodically going round, fastidiously removing any specks of dirt like this, and keep cleaning the cocktail stick as well. If you get a really stubborn bit, you can dip the cocktail stick into white spirit, soak it in, and then loosen the paint off that way. I'm just checking that there's nothing on the edges of the flanges as well there. And if these wheel treads are really dirty and very tarnished, you can try a more drastic option. Put them in a mini drill, spin it round and hold something like a fiberglass brush against it to give it a really good scouring, but hopefully that won't be necessary with these. Moving on to the bogie frames now, before I paint these, there's a couple of operations that I want to do which will be very much easier with this unpainted and without the wheels fixed in place. The first is to just open out this slot for the bogie pivot to go between, and the second is to bend these representations of the guard irons to shape. Not only would these be tricky to get hold of to bend with the wheels in the way, but we'd also probably distort the frames and stop the front axle from rotating to boot. Anyway, we'll look at the hole in the middle first, and you may recall some time ago we discussed a part like this, which is the bogie pivot spring, and that's going to engage inside that slot and slide from side to side. Now, I don't propose to make a bogie pivot spring now, we'll do that later. It's kind of a double top hat shape with the spring soldered on, and that's the sort of piece that I would normally go straight to my lathe to make, but I promised I wouldn't, so for you I'm going to make it from a bit of brass tube and a 12BA washer. And this tube is 1.5mm outside diameter, 1mm inside diameter, and it just won't go through the washer and it just won't go through this slot. Fortunately, 1mm is just perfect clearance for 14BA nut that goes up the inside, and the Farish coupling spring slides perfectly up the outside. So we need to widen this slot. I measured it and it's about 1.3mm wide as it comes. I can't use a broach on this, so I'm going to have to use a round file. I'm going to put it in at one end and just twiddle this file round and round, just using a rotation motion. Makes a little pear shape there, and then get the brass tube and try it, and it still won't quite go in. So again, this is one of these cases where you're doing fitting, so you have to file a bit, then test, file a bit more. Just going very gently with this. Test it again, and that's a nice sliding fit in there. So we can turn this frame over and do the same thing at the other side. Quite tricky to get hold of. So file this round and I'll end up with something a bit like a figure 8 shape when I finish this. Again, not quite. File a bit more. And hopefully this time my brass tube will fit in. It'll fit in at the bottom, it'll fit in at the top, but it won't slide up and down. So I need another file now, and this is a flat file but with a tapered end, so it can fit into that slot. And those little sticky in bits at the figure 8, I'm just filing them away very, very gently and very, very carefully with the end of this file to make the sides of that slot flat again. And with a bit of luck now, the tube will go in and it just sticks with it. I can force it from one end to the other, but it needs another little bit of filing. What I'm after here is a close but smooth sliding fit of this tube in the slot. And I'm going very gently indeed with this file because I don't want to overdo it. And if I test it again, that's just about perfect now. So there it is. And we can start thinking now about those guard irons and bending them to shape. So for these, I'm going back to the watchmaker's vise. I'm checking with a straight edge that I'm holding this frame level. So I'm holding the end level with the bottom of the frame, and I'm going to bend this lifeguard out to nearly horizontal. And the bend in it is going to be roughly level with the bottom edge of the main part of the frame. So use something fairly substantial to do the bending with, because this brass is fairly thick. It's got no fold lines or anything on it. So I'm just going to bend against the jaws of the vise, and that will give me a clean bend line on there. And once I've done one, we'll repeat the process with the other one, taking care to get it lined up, get it level with the top of the vise jaws. That isn't quite. Once it's adjusted, tighten them up, and then fold this one over, remembering to fold it the other way. So they look good. Look on the end, they're even. And now what we can do is, with some flat nose pliers, just hold the very tip of those irons, about 0.5 millimetre or so. Just doing this by eye and feel, and bend them down back to the vertical again. And get the other one and do the same. And this gives us a decent approximation of the shape of these things. And with a bit of luck, those bits sticking down should line up with the centre of the wheel treads. So I'm going to get a couple of these painted bogie wheels and just put them in position in the axle holes and line up a straight edge with the bottom of them. And I can see that these guard irons, there is quite a gap between the bottom of the guard iron and where the rail will be. So I've got room for adjustment now. Take the wheels out and get some very thin-nosed pliers and just bend these down a touch so they're not quite horizontal, and that will lower them. I'll do both sides. Just pull that tip out so that it's pointing vertically down again. And if we look now, that gap is reduced a little bit. I think that looks a bit better. And if we look at it from end on, we see that it's lined up in front of the wheel tread where that's going to run, which is where it needs to be. So once we've done that, we can paint it, and we're following exactly the same procedure as before, washing on this paint fairly thin and fairly liberally. And I just want to show you another technique of how we get rid of some of this paint if I manage to paint it accidentally on purpose on the face of this phosphor bronze bearing, because I don't want it on the bearing face. Well, before I do that, just paint around here, paint on the edges, paint the inside edge as well actually, bottom edge, just go around. Okay, so I've gone over that bearing face a little bit more now, just to be cruel. And I'm going to take a cotton bud. Now these are Muji cotton buds. They're a bit denser than your Johnson & Johnson ones, not quite so hairy. And dip it in thinners, stick it in the bearing, twizzle it round, and that will remove any stray paint. And then with the dry end, now put the wet end in first, and then go back in with the dry end to wipe off the thinners. It doesn't matter if I take some of the paint away where I don't want it to be taken away. Here it's not really going to matter because these will be behind the centre of the bogie wheels, but it's easy enough to flood in a bit more paint around the edge of those bearings and be more careful this time. And if we go back to the main frames and have a look at that centre bearing that was filed flush with the frames, I've used the cotton bud soaked in thinners technique again there to just go in, rub it round and make a circular shape around the bearing where there's no paint, so the back of the wheel boss can rub against that if it need be. One final thing to note is where I've gone along and painted just along the bottom edge of these frames in grey, where they might be seen. The rest of the inside of the frames can remain unpainted because they'll never be seen on this particular model. So now I think these frames are just about ready for some wheels.